has come as a result. I'm hoping that even new ministries have come out of this. Maybe people are answering their call because of this series. But this series, it was designed intentionally to help us think about issues as it pertains to matters of social justice and matters that impact us as a human race as a whole. And my hope through this series is that through awakening, we are receiving a new set of eyes, perhaps a new perspective, perhaps even a new positioning from the worldview that perhaps we were raised in. And the reason why I'm kind of pushing for this is so that we may be able to take those steps towards the necessary reform that it will take from us as both an individual and collective community, so that we may get that much closer to achieving this beloved community that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s theology presented. This is a community where everyone is valued with the same intrinsic and sacred worth as God values us. This is a community where our differences, whether it be because of race, ability, educational background, socioeconomic status, and more, are not used as a justification for the devalued treatment of persons, but on the contrary, my hope is that our differences are received with open hearts and minds, and dare I even say, celebrated. Hallelujah. I loved, though, Coretta Scott King's example to get that female voice, the wife of Reverend Dr. King, of what her thought was a beloved community is. She said it's basically the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. And this is what she said about being Dr. King's spouse. She said, to serve, she said, quoting her husband, all one needs is a heart of grace and a soul generated by love. I'll say that again. She said, all one needs is a heart of grace and a soul generated by love. And so this is kind of why my sermons are always pushing for us to go there, because I believe that is the art of what it means to try to strive for that Christian perfection and love of God. So looking at our gospel today then, my awakening moment centers around the mentioning of this unclean spirit in our gospel this morning. And before weaving this gospel completely into the conversation, it may be woven in a way you may not even anticipate, I'm just going to make a public acknowledgement as it pertains to the church as a whole. For last week, I declared how much I love the church. I also, in the same breath, as I take in this new language presented in our gospel this morning, raised a sobering reality that the church also has some level of an unclean spirit in it. I didn't name it as this last week. I stated that I stated it like reform must begin in our local churches first if we hope to reform the world. However, this is why I love scripture, because it's a continuous conversation in our journey. Now that I'm looking at our gospel this week, in many ways, I'm seeing an embedded charge not to let the church off the hook like I was hoping to. Instead, this imagery of an unclean spirit, it challenges me, and I hope you feel safe with me in this dialogue, to go further from what I did last week. This imagery, church, of an unclean spirit, although unpleasant, and although it seems almost taboo to put it in line with the church, I realized, for me, the unclean spirit actually defines the problem that I was raising last week within the church more accurately than I could have ever defined on my own, because you see, I did it. Now I'm doing it. And what is being defined for me is that there is indeed an unclean spirit within most churches, if not all, that needs to be called out if we wish to embody what it means to love God and love neighbor. If this message is unsettling, I invite you to look at part 1, because you'll kind of know why I'm going in this direction, because it's in our book of discipline that I'm supposed to go in this direction and name it. So I'm going to name it this morning. There is an unclean spirit that needs to be identified and named for what it is, so that we can begin to make spaces for God's inclusive love to permeate in our spaces of worship and collaboration and teaching. And for those who may be tempted to think that I may be making a metaphorical mountain out of a molehill, for those who may not be willing to see that the church plays a major role in perpetuating the global racism, marginalization, and oppressive epidemic that we are attempting to conquer together, allow me to share with you a letter that I promised to share in part 1 of this sermon in our earlier service for our time today. This is a hard letter, and I'm putting that out there. But this is a letter that I think needs to be heard. There was an anonymous letter sent to an African-American young female clergy in another Methodist conference, whom I will not name her specifically, because I don't want us to get sidetracked from the content here and what's really happening. And I don't want us searching all over the internet for the conference, because that's not important either. But I'm really raising this unclean spirit that occurs sometimes in what's supposed to be the church. So this omission, I pray, does not omit the fact that there is an unclean spirit sometimes in these churches. So the letter to this associate pastor, African-American clergy, says this: Dear Pastor, I and many other FUMC members, I'm not talking about Lincoln, okay? I and many other FUMC members, I believe, are dismayed by what we are seeing every Sunday. We are a progressive church, but we are, capitalized, not a hippie organization. I'm referring to your image with most recently a nose ring and blue jeans jacket as seen on our Zoom church services. 2, your hairstyle leaves one wondering, are you a teenager or an adult fanatic? This is hard, folks. When we were first introduced to you via a family photo, you had long black hair, very attractive. Now, however, long dangly earrings may be the vogue, but they are uninviting as seen on the close-up screen. Your messages are excellent if you could become one of us figuratively. Ooh, child. Our relationship will be much better. Anonymous. Bear with me, church, because this type of letter is bringing all sorts of emotions within me. And so it may appear that this sermon is going to jump all over the place. But I promise you, if you stay with me, if you trust the Spirit in this, I'm going somewhere. But I need to let you know that my heart is pounding so fast, because this is the type of microaggression that I was alluding to experiencing on some level last week as a black female pastor serving a cross-cultural context. And I'm talking about all my years of cross-cultural. Because the temptation for hopefully only a small portion of you listening online is to assume that this letter is solely about church attire and nothing more. On the surface, one who is not awakened to the nuances of microaggression and how it reveals itself, it could appear that this letter is simply addressing long dangly earrings and naming it as distracting. On the surface, one who is not awakened to the nuances of microaggressive language and statements, one could even get hung up on why a clergy person would choose to wear a jean jacket over her clergy shirt in the first place, and even name it as inappropriate for church attire, especially for a pastor. On the surface, an antagonist to the notion that microaggression even exists or is even valid would make the claim that a pastor should look a certain way, speak a certain way, carry themselves in a certain way, and if by some chance that said pastor does not fit that mold, then he, she, or they would have every right to have a letter of this nature served to them. Let me just attempt to calm down enough to relate to you what I mean by microaggression, because I used that statement last week. So an article that my hubby sent me, as he loves to collaborate with me on sermon planning from time to time when I share with him thoughts that I'm thinking about, Steve sent me an article entitled, "Are You a Microaggressor?" And I need to tell y'all, after this article that he has read, our marriage is even better, because he was able to acknowledge that microaggression in our interracial marriage, it happens to me and him, as far as him towards me, all the time. So he apologized, and I fell in love all over again, because you could see the light bulb came on, right? But in this article, it revealed that the term microaggression was originally coined in the 1970s. So it's not a new term, but it's a term you don't really hear, by Chester M. Pierce. This is a Harvard professor who first identified this type of frequent and negative, albeit unintentional, due to unconscious bias behavior towards someone of a marginalized group. Studies show that microaggressions are far more dangerous than many realize. For the seemingly innocuous and sometimes unnoticed slights come at a high cost to our mental, physical, and emotional health. In fact, we're discovering, the article says, that for people of color, it causes real trauma. I'm talking about PTSD trauma. Furthermore, people fed, watch this, a regular diet of microaggressions display signs of depression, which I think I'm coming out of, I hope of, lack of confidence, that has happened, failure to thrive, anger, helplessness, and even hopelessness. Finally, from all of this, the million-dollar question could be to ask, is a microaggressor racist? Is a microaggressor racist? According to this article, the softer side of this behavior isn't straight up racism. It's not straight up racism. Microaggressors often, however, constitute off-the-cuff quips and conduct that causes someone to feel discouraged or like an outsider for any number of traits, not just race. So this can happen for any other reason as well. So what has been the awakening moment of this article? Why am I bringing this up? According to the article, because microaggressions are often committed without the perpetrator being truly aware of their offenses, a lack of diversity, be it LGBTQ+, women, people of color, or any marginalized group, contributes to these hurtful scenarios. So you're seeing, it's like in our reconciling statement, I might be calling people, talking about people of color, but you take that out, you can plop in any other section of our reconciling statement, and I would tell you that the marginalized groups and these persons can resonate with this. So in my book, taking all this in, thank you, Steve, honey, for the article, microaggression in many ways is worse than racism for me. Because oftentimes, since the microaggressor is not even aware of how harmful the language and biases are, one can see then how this makes for a debilitating environment for the marginalized community. Because during the times of segregation that I was not alive during, from my perspective, at least a person of color knew where they stood. At least the biases were being named directly, even though it was blatantly wrong. But in this world of microaggression, God help me with the truth-telling, one could easily dismiss this type of discrimination as even happening. One could easily justify these types of seemingly unintentional quips as being nothing but a simple misunderstanding. One could easily dismiss the one who is offended as just being too sensitive. This is why I am grateful for the educated pursuers of social justice, giving this type of discrimination a name, microaggression. This is why in unpacking this very difficult letter, I stopped by to suggest that microaggression is the culprit that undergirds this letter, folks. However, I need to also name that this letter is racist as well. For when the letter addresses the pastor's hair, let me just name that for me, that part was just downright racist altogether. And I'm glad I haven't had any hair issues here, but I have had hair issues in other contexts. For the hair that my colleague sports, I stopped by to say, y'all, it's her natural hair that she was born with. This is why there are laws striving to be passed everywhere, condemning businesses and organizations from discriminating against women of color in particular, and men because of their hair that they were born with, hair that is part of their race and ethnicity. Furthermore, the reason why I deem this letter as coming from an unclean spirit, because number one, it wasn't signed, so there was no opportunity for this clergy person to even engage in conversation. So you know the intent. But I'm also raising this because an unclean spirit, sometimes like this occurs in churches as a body, and I believe it needs to seriously be examined. Especially, particularly because of the last line of this letter, that I think is the crux of our missional dilemma we're in, of why the pews are empty. Although the entire letter is atrocious and unfathomable for me to even wrap my head around, that is actually coming from a local church somewhere, the last line of this letter, I think, is our missional crisis, where it says, your messages are excellent. If you could become one of us figuratively, our relationship will be much better. If you can become one of us. Yes, this is why I can now name why that story of the 10 lepers that I raised again last week bothers me so much. If you can just become one of us, yes, this is why it feels difficult for black and brown bodies to be able to exist and thrive in white spaces. If you can just become one of us, yes, this is the judgment that keeps those that identify as spiritual but not religious from entering into the church. If you can just become one of us. Lord, help us, Jesus. For I pray that this type of unclean spirit comes from a place of unintentional ignorance and not willful evilness. Wherever it comes from, I stop by to decree and declare that this type of unclean spirit needs to be denounced. For I can empathize with this pastor on so many levels, so much so that I began to wonder, how could she even continue with ministry after that? How can this pastor go on to serve this church and preach in this church after that? To attempt to answer these questions, this is why I need y'all to watch part one. I go back to my earlier sermon this morning. Part one of this sermon that I'm inviting you all to listen to, I talked about the role of the prophets in our Deuteronomy lesson. I gave a modern day definition for a prophet of those times that fits our context in today's time, I believe, so much. I mentioned how, according to a new theologian that I came across in my studies, Mary Donovan Turner's description of the prophet's role back in the biblical times, but it fits today. She said the prophet was to bring a particular word to their communities depending upon the political and social circumstances of their places and times. She goes on to say the role of the prophet made sure to use language and metaphors that reflected their observations of the daily living of the Israelites and the national political situation of their rulers. Furthermore, I define the youth and young adults of our day as being those modern day prophets of our day. That's why that young pastor is there wearing those earrings. That's why she is wearing the blue jean jacket. That is why she is wearing her natural hair. I'm identifying this pastor and this horrific letter that was written to her as one of the modern day prophets of our day. Because watch this. I'm going to tell you how her story goes. I'm impressed because I don't know if I can do it, folks. I'm too tenderhearted. But this is what she's doing. Instead of her buckling to the demands of this letter, oh my gosh, she chose to turn this letter into a movement toward dismantling racism, microaggression, and oppression. A movement, watch this, that invited hundreds of clergy women, white, black, brown, you name it, to wear dangly earrings in the pulpit when they preach. I mean, the loudest, most dangly earrings you can find. As a side note, I would wear earrings as well, but for me, I can't wear a lot of jewelry in the pulpit. It feels restrictive to me. Y'all have even seen me take off bracelets and stuff, right? So I'm a little upset that I can't join that movement, but what I can do, since this pastor is only the associate pastor, and I don't mean that as a punitive thing, but she doesn't get to preach week to week, what I can do, though, is preach. What I can do is share her story in the pulpit as I have done. What I can do is continue to use my voice in spite of my fear, because I am very afraid, as it pertains to matters of social injustice, racism, oppression, and now microaggression. That's a new word. Most importantly, though, why I am in awe of this strong woman of faith in God is that to continue this movement of dismantling racism and oppression, not only are they wearing long dangling earrings, but she is holding her conference accountable. She's holding her local church accountable. She is holding the powers of the church that be accountable for allowing this unclean spirit to continue to contaminate the gospel and the spirit of the church. She has led a ministry, folks, of transparency, where the letter I just read, now another letter is coming out. A letter addressing this as unclean. A letter addressing this is wrong. And in solidarity now, this letter will be circulating amongst all of the clergy of different conferences to sign, coming up with a formalized statement that essentially microaggression and marginalization of all kinds will no longer be tolerated. A letter that will let any anonymous unclean spirit know that their scathing words will be exposed and denounced. A letter that as soon as I get my hands on it, I plan to sign it boldly. So you see, church, it may have seemed as if I did not address our gospel at all today. For I gave no historical account of this passage for my aspiring theologians, it may seem. But as verse 25 of our gospel reveals Jesus doing, where it says, "But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him." I would suggest that I perhaps revealed more history than one might think out of this gospel. For history like this does not need to be researched, for unfortunately, it is still our story today. History that reveals that there are unclean spirits of racism, marginalization, oppression, and more, unapologetically operating from unclean spaces. Furthermore, there is a generation of youth and young adults, just as I named in this pastor's movement that she's leading now. There's a new generation, folks, of modern-day prophets that some antagonists would call the cancel culture, but I believe they're doing some of the same things that Jesus is doing in our gospel today. They are rebuking microaggression. They're rebuking oppression. They're rebuking racism. They're rebuking all of these isms and marginalizations with the same type of boldness and authority as Jesus is doing, leaving many of us from the present and former generations, like the disciples of our gospel, amazed, asking one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority. This is why I suggest that there is a lot we can learn from the Amanda Gormans of our day, the beautiful poised poet that rocked the nation. There is a lot we can learn from the nose ring wearing, blue jean jacket wearing, natural hair wearing, modern day prophets of today. So let our prayer continue to be as the church, desiring for our spirits to be made clean again. Let our prayer be, tell us more.